Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast. And I am very pleased to have on the podcast my friend and regular guest now. I think this is number 4 or 5 for you, huh, Rick?
I think it's 5 by my count, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's 5. So this is your 5th time being on. It's Rick Belden. We've had some fascinating conversations. Our last conversation was actually about mortality, for God's sake. And that was a powerful conversation. And so today we're going to talk about something that I'm really looking forward to, and I think is going to be another powerful conversation, and that is personal mythologies. Our lives are stories that we have written, and sometimes we write them consciously and sometimes we write them unconsciously. But we start writing them very young. And what Rick is going to talk to us about is not just the stories we write, but who's the character in those stories and how that influences our lives as children and our lives as adults. Is that a fair description?
Yes, that's an excellent description.
Nice. I got excellent. I'll take it.
Right.
I'll take it. So set it up for us. What exactly is a personal mythology?
Well, in the sense that I'm using it, a personal mythology is, well, I'll back up just a little bit. I think just about everybody that's listening is familiar with mythology in general, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology, and so forth, which I think of as collective mythologies. Those are the mythologies that are developed in a specific region or a certain culture, and they're developed and passed down over generations, and they're external to you as an individual. So when you enter life, when you're born into a culture that has certain predefined mythologies that are waiting there for you to take on as part of the process of building your consciousness. For me, a personal mythology is something that is, rather than being developed or interjected into your consciousness from the outside in, it takes elements from the outside that are that have a personal connection or a personal resonance with you, and then you develop that mythology as a unique mythology that's just for you from the inside out.
So say more about that, from the inside out. What does that mean?
So, for example, as a child, there are certain things that appeal to your imagination, certain fictional figures. And in the case of my childhood, I was very drawn to all kinds of superheroes, Superman, Batman, and others. And they became a part of my internal life. They became friends. They became integral figures in my imagination. And so I began to adopt certain stories and certain beliefs and certain concepts around them that I applied to myself as a child because I pretended to be them. So there were certain elements of whatever persona they might have as a fictional character that I admired and I, in some sense, wanted to emulate. And so I began to integrate those into my sense of identity as a child through play and through imagination and through having aspirations that were aligned with whatever that character's best qualities were.
So do we all have this? Is this something that every child has, or it's not all superheroes, right? I mean, I think that's a given, but do all people have something like this?
It's hard for me to say all, categorically, but I think that it's pretty common. I know women that really loved Little House on the Prairie when they were little girls. And so, Half Pint on that show might be part of their personal mythology because as a girl, that was someone they could identify because she was kind of heroic and she had struggles and so forth and went through different adventures and approached all kinds of challenges and problems. And so I think that it's just natural for children because they're always looking for role models. And role models could be a physical person who's present. It could be a real person like the president or an athlete, or it could be a fictional character that they feel drawn to because that represents aspects of themselves that they would like to develop or they would like to have.
Yeah. Now, first, I'm just going to say, we're definitely dating ourselves when we talk about Little House on the Prairie.
That's for sure.
But the idea is that we gravitate toward these symbols, these ideas, these characters, these TV shows, these movies. We gravitate towards something and we like it so much that we begin to act it out and take it on and internalize some of the characteristics into who we even are. And we do the role playing, but it even can get bigger than that where it becomes a part of our personality. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, not necessarily overtly, but I think it is certainly can be the case that we might, as children, identify certain qualities or certain ways in which that character sees and approaches the world. And we might decide, not necessarily consciously as children, that, oh, that's a good way to do that, or that's a good way to think about that, or that's a good way to handle myself in this kind of situation. And then that just sort of gets integrated into the identity that we're building. And then as an adult, we may behave in a certain way that's actually quite similar to the character that we observed as a child, but we're not necessarily conscious of that there's any sort of connection or any sort of template there that we have evaluated and accepted and internalized, and now we're using that as a foundation for how we see or behave or think or perceive in certain situations.
Yeah, I mean, without getting too religious at this point, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and that's a big part of who I am and always will be, regardless of how I practice it now. But I was raised with the idea of Jesus Christ and was taught to model my behavior and my thinking after him. That's a similar idea, right?
I think so because again, for me, the personal part of the personal mythology is that you actually take that figure into yourself in some way and you create your own version of that internally that works for you.
And the difference being that religion is usually not often a choice for the child. It's something that is imposed upon them, either lightly imposed or harshly imposed, but imposed nonetheless. And what we're talking about is when there's a little bit more choice and agency involved in choosing these characters, these mythologies, these people and characters that resonate with us and that we get to begin to, as you said, emulate. So why would we care about this as adults? I mean, you're talking about this and some listeners might be saying, I mean, okay, yeah, I played with, Superman when I was a kid. I had the comics. I did this, I did that, but why bring it up on the Man Rules podcast?
Well, I think the primary reason that it can be useful and important is that most of us have disconnected in some way with younger aspects of ourselves. And those younger aspects of ourselves can still be very much alive inside us, and they can also be very active and very influential in our patterns of thought, belief, action, the choices that we make, and so forth. And sometimes people get into a bit of trouble in their lives because they engage in behaviors or patterns of behaviors that are unsuccessful for them, and they don't know why. And it can be the case, and it was the case for me personally, that I was disconnected from some younger aspects of myself that were still quite influential in terms of how I perceived and how I made decisions and actions and choices I made. And it wasn't until I was able to reconnect with those parts of myself that I started to develop a fuller understanding of myself and fuller understanding of why I was having some of the experiences I was having and how I might go about changing them.
So and these parts, sorry to interrupt really quick though. So these parts of yourself, because there's some people who are going to say, you know what, I disconnect from my childhood because that was childhood. I'm an adult now and I've put away childish things, so to speak. So what you're saying is, well, you probably haven't put them away. Some aspects of it are still alive, and they're having a greater influence on you than you may realize. So until you become more conscious of these, they will continue to affect you in a way that you may not be familiar
Yes,
or
and you may
aware.
not like.
And you may not like. So the idea is that there's some integration here that's going to happen, that's going to offer some greater consciousness and some greater ability to navigate our current relationships. That this isn't about going back and picking up our superhero dolls and watching one more version of Batman, hopefully without Ben Affleck. Um, so what?
Yeah, so the idea is that, how do you establish communication, and how do you establish a relationship with a younger part of yourself that may be hidden or closed off? And one of the ways to do it is to begin to reconnect with something that you liked at that age that was important to you. And so the kind of personal mythology stuff that we're talking about today is one way to do that.
Well, give some examples, because I think, this is always tricky for people. I used to resist this idea myself because it just felt goofy to me. This idea of younger parts of myself and that whole thing, I had a lot of judgments about. So what are some of the impacts that these younger parts in yourself can have on your present life? I mean, make it real for my listeners on, why this is more than just a conversation, that this is about the lives that they're leading and their relationships.
Well, I think the best way to do that is just go directly to my experience that led me to come to the conclusion that this was important not only for me, but for other people. When I was a child, I was very particularly interested in Iron Man. That was the one out of all of the ones that I identified with the most closely. And what happened to me was when I was in my late 20s, I started to have a lot of dreams about Iron Man. And I thought, well, this is very odd because I haven't thought about this in about, 15, almost 20 years. As you said, I'd given away all my comics, I'd given away all my models a long, long time ago. And I thought, what could this possibly mean? Why would I be having these dreams?
And this is before Robert Downey Jr.
Yes, well before. This was the late 80s. So Iron Man was a very, very obscure, very below the radar superhero at that time. And so there wasn't anything in the culture that was prompting me to have these dreams. It was something that was coming up from inside me. And as I began to explore that, and as I began to work with it, I began to see what a powerful metaphor that was for me as a child, and how it had continued to influence me. So for those that maybe almost everybody's familiar now, but Iron Man he's a very smart guy. He's an inventor. He's very rich, and his heart gets injured. And so under duress, he creates this superpowered suit of armor, which has a chest plate that keeps his heart pumping because he's been injured. So it protects his wounded heart. And he has a suit of armor. He has a face mask to protect his identity and keep it secret. And his armor has all sorts of powers. He can fly. He can shoot out different kinds of beams and rays to protect himself and so forth. There's all kinds of gadgets and so forth. And that was real appealing to me as a kid because I felt real vulnerable. And I was in a family situation where my heart was getting hurt all the time. And I loved the idea of just being able to put on a bunch of armor so that no one could hurt me, and put on a mask so that no one could see my expressions, so they wouldn't know if I was, feeling disappointed or if I was upset, and being able to hide my identity and basically inventing my way out of things and surrounding myself with something that could not be penetrated so I couldn't be hurt anymore. And so as I started to make connection with that when I was about 29 or 30, I started to realize that that was the way I was operating in the world as an adult. I was very armored up in the sense that I didn't let people too close to me. I had sort of a demeanor and sort of a way of acting that kept people at some distance. I kept my emotions as close to, being hidden as I possibly could. I had some escapist tendencies. And so I began to realize that I still was operating out of that same sort of connection with that character that I had as a child, and that it was almost like the armor was too small for me now. It wasn't working anymore, and it was cramping me and constraining me and keeping me from fully experiencing life. And so it was the sort of understanding of how those metaphors kind of got translated into the way that I saw myself and the way that I saw the world as being not really safe, and not really necessarily being capable of taking care of myself if I didn't have my armor on, because I just felt so vulnerable, like I could just get sliced to pieces.
Mm.
And my heart was still feeling wounded too, so I wanted to protect that. So there was a lot of figurative and metaphorical and behavioral armor around my heart as well. So it gave me a lot of information about why I was at a point in my life where I felt stagnant, and I felt like I was just isolated and alone and really unable to reach out, and it didn't seem like people could reach me either.
Yeah, that's powerful. And, I think a lot of men can identify with that idea of armor and having armor on of some kind. Was there a more positive aspect of it as well?
Yeah, there was. But one of the things that's great about, and people know this from the movies, about that his actual identity, Tony Stark, he's quite intelligent and he's quite ingenious, and so that also meant that I was able to access that part of myself as well. The inventiveness and the sort of confidence that, yes, I can figure things out. And what I needed to do was bring that into balance with the feelings of that it's okay not to be in my armor all the time.
So how could I recognize maybe what I'm carrying around with me? You had your experience, but I mean, it seemed to really kind of tap you on the back of the shoulder by starting to have dreams about Iron Man, and you explored that. But let's say it's not that obvious or explicit for me. How do I begin to notice what some of these might be for me and how it shows up in my masculinity today?
Well, I guess I would ask you, what are some of the fictional characters that you remember from your boyhood that you really identified with, that really spoke to you?
Well, let's do this. Let's do it for me, and let's see if this helps our listeners too. So,
Okay.
because I haven't completely explored these, but let's just see. One that comes to mind immediately, and I'll see what you think about that, is Jesse James.
Okay, that's great.
I love Jesse James, even though he is not known for being a really nice guy and he hurt a lot of people. There was something that was attractive to me about Jesse James.
Okay, do you remember what age?
Well, I would get the books from the library about the Wild West and about the outlaws. I loved reading about outlaws, and I was probably 9 or 10.
Okay. And do you remember what appealed to you about outlaws?
Well, it was probably the fact that they were against society,
Okay.
that they were able to fight back, and they were able to really kind of take on society. They were able to do their own thing and do what they wanted. They were able to fight back, but there was also this idea of they lived by their own rules.
Okay. And do you have any insight into why that would be appealing to you as a 9 or 10-year-old boy?
Well, I grew up in an alcoholic home, which I, don't want to always use that as the go-to for my life experience. But the truth is, I did grow up in an alcoholic home. There was a lot of inconsistency and a lot of anger. And I always had that personality of challenging authority.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that.
So did you feel that the family system that you lived in was repressive or unjust in some way?
Well, I thought everything was unjust. I mean, it wasn't just my family. School was unjust. Teachers were unjust. Religion was unjust.
Okay.
I was a justice vigilante. I just really saw injustice everywhere.
Okay. So how do you express your affinity for Jesse James as in your life as an adult today?
I don't know. Let me reflect on that. Do I? I don't think I go by my own rules as much as I used to. I try to get along with people, and I try not to always be the force of opposition. So I don't fight with people the way I used to. I don't seek out arguments and that sort of thing. I still am very interested in injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that. But if I were interested in justice, it wouldn't pull me toward Jesse James. I mean, there was a lot of injustice by Jesse James. I mean, you can make an argument, and I think this is part of the story, is that they were fighting back against how they were treated. I don't think that they were, I can't remember correctly, but I think their origin as outlaws was not one where it was like, hey, let's just rob a bunch of banks. That there was something that they started off with. There was like some larger injustice that might have happened to them that they were fighting against, or some impending calamity where they had to get money. But I could be confusing that with any number of Western shows or movies.
Right.
So,
right.
You tell me.
So when I suggested that we do this little experiment,
yeah,
and Jesse James came up first, were you surprised that was the one that came up first?
I was very surprised that Jesse James came up first. I would have thought it'd be any of the number of superheroes or somebody more like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that suggests to me that he's still in there somewhere.
Okay. So let's stay on this. Let's figure out why. Because I think there might be some listeners who somebody popped up in their head, and maybe their immediate response was like, maybe the person that popped up in their head was a girl or something that people identify with as being more girlish, but for them back then that was something significant. Or maybe it's something that seems quote unquote stupid to them. I certainly was surprised that Jesse James came up for me.
Well, and I'm glad that came up because, in my case, the Iron Man thing, he's a character that he has some character flaws, but he's generally regarded as heroic. But the figure that comes up for any individual that they might have felt attracted to when they were a boy it could be somebody who's morally ambiguous, like Jesse James, in the case that you brought up.
Yeah, I don't even know if Jesse James was morally ambiguous.
Well, I guess that's part of the mystique around him, right? Is you're not really sure.
Yeah.
But somebody could, in the recent Avengers movie, Thanos was considered to be the villain. But I can imagine somebody saying, well, I actually feel some affinity with that guy. And so it doesn't have to be somebody that's necessarily heroic or even a good role model.
Yeah, as devastating as what Thanos did for those people who haven't watched the movies, especially Endgame or the Infinity Wars, spoiler alert, but, for him to really I think his intentions were good. I don't think he saw evil. And I think that was really typified by where he was at the beginning of Endgame and how he had just really put all his armor and all of his battle gear away and was just living in a hut on a planet, just trying to have a simple life. And that his whole method for getting to that place was horrible. I mean, it was, something, but the idea that he had tried to establish order and peace through these just horrific means, I can see how somebody would be somewhat sympathetic to that, or would see like, okay, I can see the logic in that, even though it's absolutely inhumane to do it that way, that his intentions were good. But I don't identify with Thanos, so let's not spend too much time on that.
Right.
I'm intrigued by Jesse James. I want to spend time on Jesse James and see what we can get out of this personal mythology thing. So help me unpack this some more.
So you were surprised initially that Jesse James was the figure that came up for you.
Yeah,
And,
first one, bam. No
yeah, right.
superhero, no military hero or like Rambo or anything like that. No TV character, Jesse James.
hmm And so, as we've been talking about that, have you had any flashes of memory or any sorts of additional thoughts about what was going on at that time in your life?
I remember, here's what I remember about Jesse James. I remember that Bobby, I think it was Bobby in the Brady Bunch, had also this real affinity for Jesse James, and his parents were disturbed by that. And so he either Bobby had a dream or they had him read more about Jesse James, but he learned, basically the point of the Brady Bunch episode was to show that Jesse James was evil and that he hurt a lot of people and that being an outlaw was not a sexy or a cool thing by any means. And so that was part of it. But I do remember that episode, or at least parts of that episode, being about that. And until Bobby saw it happening to his family and saw Jesse James attacking his family, he really didn't get how it was not cool.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you remember your experience of watching that?
I do remember my experience of watching that. I remember watching it and still thinking Jesse James was pretty cool.
So you were committed to it,
And at the same time, I got the lesson.
right?
I got the lesson of like, oh, this guy hurt a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
He hurt a lot of innocent people, and it wasn't just robbing banks. There were innocent people that got hurt.
Right. But was it your impression that he felt justified in what he was doing?
Yeah, I think I always had a sense that he felt justified in what he was doing.
So this is very similar to the Thanos thing after all.
Maybe. Say more about that.
Well, you said he hurt a lot of people, but he felt justified in what he was doing. And that's very consistent with some of the things you were saying about your impression of Thanos as well.
Yeah, so are we saying here that I'm a psychopath and that my heroes are villains?
No, not at all. But
Okay.
I am suggesting the possibility that, for some kids who are in difficult situations, they may not gravitate to the characters that have the highest ethical and moral standards and behavior. They may gravitate to the character that's getting something done that they feel is justified because of the situation that they're in.
Mm. Yeah, no, I can see how there'd be a parallel. I mean, I felt very powerless and I felt like there was a lot of injustice in my house.
Mm-hmm.
My dad ruled with an iron fist. I mean, I'm not going to say, like, I've gotten to a totally different place with my father than I used to be. And so it's always weird for me talking about him because, I mean, there's a factual statement. He was alcoholic. It's a factual statement. He had a bad temper. And it's a factual statement that I was a really sensitive and emotional kid who didn't know how to navigate any of that. I wasn't a tough guy. And so my dad scared me, and he scared me a lot. And so, there was an element of like, man, if somebody would just take care of this guy and get him off my back, by any means necessary, maybe that was part of it for me. I don't know.
Well, it sounds like Jesse
I've not thought about Jesse James and its impact on my life at all.
Well, Jesse James sounds like the right man for the job that you just described.
Yeah, Jesse James or an outlaw or somebody like that, it would make sense, right? Because they're the ones who are willing to go into the face of danger and they don't care necessarily what happens. But Jesse James would be as likely to come into the house and maybe not. I mean, I don't know. Would Jesse James or an outlaw be more likely to come into the house and hurt the kids as much as he hurts the adults, or would they let the kids go? I don't know if there was any kind of moral code for Jesse James.
Well, this is where the personal mythology part comes in, because there's that cultural mythology around Jesse James, and then there's the personal mythology that you developed in relationship to that persona. And so the answer to your question that you just posed is not necessarily based on that external mythology. It's based on the Jesse James that you created within yourself as a boy.
Oh, the Jesse James I created within myself as a boy definitely would not hurt the kids.
Well, see, that's the difference.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So that internalized personal Jesse James mythos that you built within yourself, he operates in a slightly different way.
So it doesn't have to be based on the actual story, and it doesn't even have to be just based on just what I knew about Jesse James. It is also what I make up about
Yes.
it to have my own personal narrative around my affiliation with the character.
Right, because you're trying to meet some sort of need. You're trying to construct something within yourself that maybe is missing on the outside, or something that you aspire to that because you're a little kid you can't quite do it. But it's a strategic construction, I guess, is the way I would put it. And so you can begin with what you're consuming from the outside, and then you customize it and you make it into something that's individual to you. And that's the personal mythology part of it. It's like you're constructing a version of Jesse James that is not the same as the one on the outside, and it's not the same as anybody else has.
Yeah. And it's interesting that really a great place to start then for anybody is just thinking about what are the one or two main characters with which you identified the most when you were a kid.
Yes.
And what comes up immediately for you, and don't judge it and don't decide whether or not it makes sense or not, but just what's the one that pops up when you're thinking about that. And then what would be, if you were coaching somebody on this, what would be the main questions you would have them explore? So for our listeners now, let's say they're interested in this and something pops up for them, and they've got Jesse James, or they've got Superman or Batman, or they've got, I don't know, Speedy Gonzalez for all.
It could be anything.
I mean, anything. Yeah. What would be the next questions that you would have somebody explore?
Well, what I would suggest that someone do, like in your case, if you want to explore this further, I would suggest that you find ways to reconnect with that character. So if there was a specific book that you remember reading as a child, I would say track it down and read it again.
Okay.
Superheroes and anybody from movies is great, because I always love to tell people, get an action figure, find a little action figure, and put it on the dash of your vehicle, carry it around with you, put it in your pocket, carry it around, whatever. The kind of thing a kid would do.
But too many people are going to say, but I don't want to do that. I'm an adult. I don't play with action figures.
Yeah, that's fine. That was my reaction at first too.
Right.
I thought there must be something wrong with me, because you don't do this sort of thing as an adult. But if you decide that you want to reconnect with yourself when you were younger, because you feel like there might be some value there, one of the easiest ways to do it is to do that sort of thing. Engage in some of the activities that you did at that age. It doesn't stop you from being an adult. It just gives you the opportunity to engage with that part of yourself, which is that's the whole point of this, in a way that part of yourself actually enjoys and can actually identify with. So you can get real intellectual about these things, and that can be part of it. But I always encourage people to take the most direct route and the simplest route. In the case of the Iron Man experience I had 30 years ago, I went to comic book stores and I found the old comic books that I had. And I bought them and I read them and I spent time with them and I cut them up with scissors and I made collages and I did all kinds of stuff, the kind of stuff I did when I was a kid. And it put me back in touch with that part of myself. And that little boy was very suspicious of me. He did not trust me. He really didn't want to deal with me because I had been disregarding him for so long.
Yeah.
But play was a good way to sort of unlock that process and start to build that relationship. And then I started to get more information from him, because that's one of the keys to this, is that oftentimes not only does your younger self have an agenda that's unfulfilled and maybe he's driving you or pushing you in directions that aren't so good, but he also has a ton of information for you that can actually be extremely helpful to you.
And so one of the ways to access that younger part of ourselves, you're saying, is through this idea, through this personal mythology, and through identifying this character or this persona.
Yes. And when you engage with that that mythological character that you've internalized and made your own version of, you're engaging with the child who actually created that figure inside you.
So, all right. So the first step is find a book or an action figure or something that's connected to that character, that persona, a movie, TV show. I could watch that Brady Bunch episode again if I could find it.
Yeah, it's probably on YouTube
Oh, you're right. It probably is on YouTube.
or Hulu.
Yeah. And then, read a book about Jesse James, or one of the books I used to read about all the different outlaws, and read about Jesse James. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia on Jesse James.
Mm-hmm.
So then what's next?
Well, I think that what's next is that you do that process. And by the way, this stuff tends to actually be fun. That's one thing some of us as men have trouble with is, having fun in ways that are healthy and easy and so forth. And this actually, it can be a lot of fun to track these things down and watch them. And so for me,
I'm excited for this podcast to be over, not because I don't enjoy speaking with you, but because I am absolutely going to look this up on YouTube and see if I can find the Brady Bunch episode.
Well, there you go. So, and that really, when you talk about next steps, I think that's a key thing, is like, notice what makes you feel excited. Like, you're excited right now. When we first started this branch of this conversation, you're just thinking, why, Jesse James, so what? What difference does it make? And now,
well, I wasn't thinking Jesse James, so what? What difference does it make? I was more thinking Jesse James, why did that come up?
Okay.
And how is there really any relevance to me today? Because it just never, it would not have occurred to me to think of Jesse James, because I don't really think of Jesse James. I think I thought of that Brady Bunch episode recently, and I'm trying to remember why. So there is that. But, so it wasn't indifference or so what. It was more kind of like, why is he popping up, and what relevance could it have? Because I haven't really engaged with Jesse James in so long.
And see, this is the sort of thing that I like to encourage people to pay attention to. You thought about that Brady Bunch episode about Jesse James recently.
Yeah.
And now you just had the opportunity, when I asked you, what would be a figure that you remember as a child that you felt resonant with, you brought it right up again. Yeah. So that, to me, that's the sort of thing I like to encourage people to look out for. In my case, it was all those dreams I had.
Right.
In your case, you've had this come up twice now recently, which suggests to me that there's something in your unconscious that is inviting you to give it some attention.
Yeah. No, I hear that, and I'm going to pay attention to that. It's interesting. So, okay, so you explore. Is there anything else that you would recommend, or any other questions you would encourage, or is there like a journaling exercise or something? I mean, make it as practical for our listeners as possible.
Well, I guess this is a case where the thing that sounds impractical is actually practical in the long run, and that is to just play with this, to enjoy it, to follow it, and to do anything you can to sort of bring it into your life. So we talked about getting an action figure, going to a comic book store, watching a movie or a TV show from that period of time that relates to the character if you can. You can do all sorts of things with art, with drawings, with collages. You can write a little story starring that persona. You could write a letter you could write a letter to Jesse James and tell him about what was going on in your life when you're a kid. Mostly, I think it's just be as creative and use as much imagination as you can, just like you did when you were a child. And the point of all of this is to connect with that part of yourself, with that aspect of yourself that's still looking for some attention, that's still waiting for some resolution on something, that has information for you that he's been holding for the last 40 or 50 years that can help you in your life today.
And chances are there's other ones too. I mean, like if you and I were having this conversation 2 weeks ago, or if we were having it in a month or a year from now, it's possible that another character could pop up and there'd be more to learn from that
Yeah, I think you
So,
could
I
make
mean,
a
like,
list.
have you
Yeah.
identified a different one other than Iron Man? Has
Well,
it
it's funny that
worked out for you in the
because
past?
Superman was like Superman was my main guy when I
Wow.
was younger, from I don't know, age 4 to maybe 8 or something like that. And then when I got a little bit older, I encountered Iron Man for the first time, and I'll never forget the first cover I saw. He was trapped in some metal tunnel, and there was another bigger Iron Man called Titanium Man. He was the Soviet Union Iron Man. That's how old this is. And it was like, wow, he's trapped in that tunnel, and how's he going to get out, and all this stuff. So something shifted for me. But yeah, certainly I think that there's a strong possibility that, especially at different ages, there were different figures that really captured your imagination. And of course, as you start moving into being a teenager, then you start operating more like an adult. You're not so open to those sorts of things. They're not so influential for you. So maybe you don't see so much of that later on. I know I think there are a lot of boys that are attracted to characters that are robots or cyborgs or androids, because for so many men, the feeling part of their experience as a boy is so threatening and so dangerous that
Mm.
they want to compartmentalize that away and just function rationally and logically all the time, because that seems like the safest thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally see that. So I really want to encourage our listeners to be open-minded about this, that it requires an open mind and a willingness to say, to just like close your eyes, take a deep breath, and think back to when you were a kid. Think back to what excited you, when you played. You know, it's so easy to get away from that and far away from that. But if there was relevance to who you were as a child to your life today, would you take the time to explore that further? And I think today's episode, I think I'm excited to see where this might lead for me. I'm going to do some exploration. Like I said, I'm going to get off here and I'm going to watch YouTube and see if I can find that episode. But it's really something that, from my experience, I've learned the value of looking into past times of my life, especially childhood, and some of those wounds that carry into adulthood and how they show up. I mean, how they influence my life today is why it matters and why it has importance. And that's what I hear you saying as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll also add, if you have if you have little boys of your own, if you have nephews, if you have grandsons, spend some time with them when they're down on the floor playing, because they can kind of lead the way for you in making that connection with some of these things for yourself.
What about little girls?
Little girls as well.
I have a
Yeah.
little girl, and I like wrestling with her and being on the floor with her. Does that work as well?
Well, I'm thinking particularly in the. I know that one of my nephews was really into wrestling,
Yeah.
and so he had all the wrestling figures. And they can, whether it's a boy or a girl, when they get down there and they're doing their imaginary play with their figures or whatever they have, they can help remind you of what that was like and sort of give you some clues about how you can approach this. And I know I went through that whole thing of feeling foolish and am I crazy? And I can't believe I'm wasting my time, playing with these action figures and making these pictures and stuff. But that's how I that's how I was able to get to that part of myself that was really crying out for help.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I can say that every time you come on this podcast, you bring rich and challenging topics that are really great for our listeners to explore. And I think you have done that again with this topic. So, as always, I want to thank you for being part of the Man Rules podcast and for coming on with your wisdom and sharing that with our listeners.
You bet, Dan. I'm always happy to do it. We always manage to get there somehow.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. So thank you to our listeners for another great episode of the Man Rules podcast. And remember, as you move through your life, it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about doing it consciously. Have a great week. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even want to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com and check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. Because the only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.